settle into your bed. Let your body relax and allow your breath to soften. Tonight, we invite you on a peaceful journey to a land that once whispered, beneath the roots of Rome. This is not the story of emperors or conquests. It is the quiet memory of a people whose voices faded before history began to speak loudly. Far from the echoes of Caesar and the Senate, before marble temples and imperial roads, there were the Etruscans. They lived among the misty hills of Tuscany, long before the name Rome meant anything at all. Their cities rose beside rivers and seas. Their hands shaped temples, their eyes watched the stars, and their tombs told stories not in words, but in brushstrokes and silence. You are about to drift through Etruria, the heartland of this forgotten civilization. A land of soft hills and ancient stone, olive trees swaying under moonlight, and underground chambers carved into the earth. In these tombs, the Etruscans painted scenes of dancers, musicians, and feasts. They believed death was not the end, but a journey one that should be welcomed with joy, music, and light. Though the Romans buried their memory, the Etruscans still speak to those who listen closely. Their language remains undeciphered, a code locked in terracotta and bronze. Their gods watched the skies, their priests read lightning, and their women walked beside men in power and dignity. They shaped the foundations of Roman art, architecture, and ritual, but in time, the student overshadowed the teacher. This bedtime story will guide you gently through their world. It is a tale of mystery, silence, beauty, and loss. As you listen, you may feel as if you are walking barefoot through morning mist in the hills of ancient Italy. You may hear a flute from long ago. You may glimpse painted figures smiling from cool stone walls, waiting to be remembered. Let the past unfold like parchment. Let your mind slow to the rhythm of forgotten footsteps. And let the Etruscans, the mysterious people before Rome, carry you softly towards sleep. Welcome to Mystic Bedtime Stories. Tonight, we begin with the first chapter, Etruria, the land of quiet people. Imagine, if you will, a time when the hills of central Italy held secrets that would remain hidden for millennia. As twilight settles over the rolling landscape of what we now call Tuscany, let us journey back through the mists of time to a land the ancient Romans called Etruria. This is the story of a people who walked these very hills more than 2,500 years ago, leaving behind whispers in stone and bronze that still echo through the cypress groves today. Close your eyes and feel the gentle Mediterranean breeze as it carries the scent of wild herbs and ancient earth. The year is somewhere around 700 BCE, and the world is a very different place. Greece is just beginning to spread its influence across the Mediterranean, while Rome is still a collection of muddy settlements on 7 hills, barely worthy of notice. But here, in this enchanted landscape between the Arno and Tiber rivers, something extraordinary is taking shape. The Etruscans called their homeland Etruria, a name that would eventually give birth to the word Tuscany itself. Picture this ancient land as it spreads before us like a living tapestry. To the west, the Tyrrhenian Sea sparkles under the setting sun, its waters lapping against coastal plains where fishing villages dot the shoreline like scattered pearls. The sea brings not just fish and salt, but ships from distant lands, carrying precious goods and new ideas that will help shape one of Italy's most sophisticated early civilizations. Moving inland from the coast, the landscape rises in gentle undulations, creating the rolling hills that would become the signature of this region. These hills, composed of soft limestone and volcanic tuff, are easily worked by human hands, making them perfect for the elaborate tombs and underground chambers that the Etruscans will carve into their very heart. The soil here is rich and dark, fed by centuries of volcanic activity from the nearby mountains, creating fertile valleys perfect for growing the grains that will sustain great cities. Between these hills run crystal-clear streams and rivers, their waters reflecting the changing sky as they wind their way toward the sea. The largest of these, the Tiber, forms the southern boundary of Etruria, while the Arno marks its northern edge. These rivers are not just boundaries, but lifelines, carrying trade goods and connecting the inland cities to the broader Mediterranean world. Along their banks, reeds whisper in the breeze, and water birds make their nests in the quiet marshes. The climate here is gentle and kind, with warm summers that ripen grapes and olives to perfection, and mild winters that rarely bring snow to the valleys. Spring arrives early, painting the hillsides with wildflowers in shades of yellow, purple, and white. It is a land that invites settlement, that welcomes the human touch. That seems almost designed for the flourishing of civilization. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of this landscape is its forests. Great oak trees spread their ancient arms across the higher elevations, their roots reaching deep into the earth, their branches home to countless birds and small creatures. Lower down, groves of olive trees shimmer silver green in the sunlight, while vineyards claim the sunny slopes. Here and there, stands of dark cypress trees pierce the sky like exclamation points, creating the dramatic silhouettes that would later inspire Renaissance painters. Scattered throughout this pastoral paradise are outcroppings of stone and mineral, veins that hint at the underground wealth that will make Etruria famous. Iron ore lies buried in the hills, waiting to be discovered and worked into tools and weapons that will give the Etruscans a significant advantage over their neighbors. Deposits of copper and tin will allow them to create bronze objects of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. Even more precious metals, silver and gold, lie hidden in the earth, waiting to be transformed into jewelry and ceremonial objects that will astound archaeologists thousands of years later. As we stand here in this ancient landscape, we can almost see the first Etruscan settlements taking shape. Small villages appear on hilltops, their position chosen for defense and for the commanding view they offer of the surrounding countryside. These early communities are modest affairs, clusters of simple dwellings surrounded by wooden palisades, but they carry within them the seeds of something greater. The people who are creating these first settlements are unlike any who have come before them in this region. They possess skills and knowledge that seem almost magical to their contemporaries. They understand the secret of working metal, transforming crude ore into gleaming bronze and iron. They know how to read the patterns in the sky and the flights of birds, interpreting the will of the gods in the natural world around them. They can write, setting down their thoughts and records in a script that borrows from the Greeks, that serves their own mysterious language. But who are these people, and where did they come from? This question has puzzled historians for centuries, and even today, it remains one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. Some say they came from the east, from the lands of Asia Minor, carrying with them the sophisticated culture of the ancient Near East. Others argue they are the descendants of the indigenous peoples of Italy, their culture evolving naturally from the simple farming communities that had lived here for generations. What we do know is that by 700 BCE, they have established themselves as masters of this beautiful land. Their settlements are growing into true cities with impressive walls and sophisticated drainage systems. They have learned to work with the natural landscape, terracing the hillsides for agriculture and carving elaborate tombs into the soft rock. They are skilled sailors and traders, their ships ranging across the Mediterranean to bring back goods from Greece, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean. The Etruscans are also master craftsmen, creating objects of such beauty and sophistication that they will be treasured for millennia. Their pottery is painted with scenes of daily life and mythology. Their metalwork shows a level of skill that rivals anything produced in the Greek world, and their jewelry demonstrates an aesthetic sense that seems surprisingly modern. But perhaps, most remarkably, The Etruscans are creating something that is still rare in the ancient world, a civilization where women enjoy a level of freedom and respect that would not be seen again in Europe for many centuries. Etruscan women can own property, participate in public life, and receive an education. They recline alongside their husbands at banquets, a practice that scandalized the Greeks and Romans, who kept their women in strict seclusion. As we explore this ancient Etruria, we find ourselves in a land that seems to exist in a state of perfect balance. The natural world and human civilization exist in harmony, each enhancing the other. The Etruscans do not seek to dominate their environment, but to work with it, to understand its rhythms and mysteries. They build their cities on hilltops, not just for defense, but because they understand that the gods dwell in high places, closer to the sky and the movements of the stars. Their agriculture is sophisticated but sustainable, working with the natural cycles of the seasons and the soil. They practice crop rotation and terracing, ensuring that the land remains fertile for generations. Their mines are worked carefully, with proper supports and drainage, showing a long-term vision that extends far beyond immediate profit. The Etruscan cities are marvels of urban planning, with straight streets laid out in geometric patterns, proper sewage systems, and public spaces designed for both practical use and aesthetic pleasure. The houses are built of local stone and timber, their walls decorated with frescoes that bring color and life to the interior spaces. Gardens and courtyards provide private retreats where families can escape the bustle of city life. But it is in their relationship with death that the Etruscans perhaps reveal most clearly their unique worldview. For them, death is not an ending, but a transformation, a passage to another realm where life continues in a different form. They create elaborate tombs that are really underground houses, complete with furniture, food, and all the necessities of daily life. The walls of these tombs are painted with scenes of joy and celebration, showing the deceased enjoying eternal banquets and festivities. These tomb paintings provide us with an extraordinary window into Etruscan daily life. We see men and women dancing and playing music, athletes competing in games, hunters pursuing wild boar through the forests, and fishermen casting their nets into the sea. We see elaborate banquets where guests recline on couches, raising their cups in eternal toasts, their faces painted with expressions of joy and contentment. The Etruscan approach to death reflects their broader philosophy of life. They believe in living fully and joyfully, in embracing the pleasures of existence, while never forgetting the presence of the divine in the natural world. Their religion is complex and sophisticated, involving elaborate rituals and ceremonies that seek to maintain harmony between the human and divine realms. As we stand here in this ancient landscape, we can feel the weight of centuries settling around us like a gentle mist. The Etruscans will flourish in this land for more than 500 years, creating a civilization that will profoundly influence the development of Rome, and through Rome, the entire Western world. Their knowledge of engineering will help build the great Roman roads and aqueducts. Their religious practices will become part of Roman ritual. Their artistic traditions will inspire generations of artists and craftsmen. Yet for all their influence, the Etruscans will gradually fade from history. Their cities conquered or abandoned, their language forgotten, their very existence eventually relegated to the realm of myth and legend. They will become the silent ones, speaking to us only through the artifacts they left behind, the frescoes on tomb walls, the bronze mirrors buried with their dead, the inscriptions carved in stone that we can read, but cannot fully understand. But in this moment, as we imagine ourselves in their world, they are very much alive. Their cities are bustling with activity. Their fields are green with crops. Their workshops ring with the sound of hammer on anvil. Children play in the streets. Women tend their gardens. Men debate politics in the public squares. Life flows through Etruria like a river, carrying with it all the hopes and dreams fears and aspirations of a people who dared to create something beautiful and lasting in this favored corner of the ancient world. The sun is setting now over the Tyrrhenian Sea, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The first stars are appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a shepherd is calling his flock home for the night. The gentle hills of Etruria settle into peaceful silence, but it is a silence full of promise, full of the accumulated wisdom of generations who have learned to live in harmony with this generous land. Tomorrow, we will explore more deeply the mysteries of these remarkable people. We will learn about their origins, their language, their cities, and their customs. We will discover how they influenced the rise of Rome and how their legacy continues to shape the world we know today. But for now, let us simply rest in the knowledge that once, long ago, in this beautiful corner of Italy, a people lived who understood that civilization is not about conquering nature, but about learning to dance with it. Not about dominating others, but about creating beauty and meaning in the brief span of human life. Sleep well, and let your dreams carry you back to the hills of ancient Etruria, where the cypress trees still stand sentinel over the tombs of the silent ones, and where the whispers of the past mingle with the gentle night breeze. As the gentle morning mist rises from the valleys of ancient Etruria, we find ourselves drawn into one of history's most enduring mysteries. Who were these remarkable people who carved their civilization into the hills of central Italy? Where did they come from? And how did they come to possess the sophisticated knowledge that set them apart from all their neighbors? Picture, if you will, the great library of Alexandria in its prime, where scholars from across the Mediterranean world gathered to debate the questions that had puzzled humanity for generations. Among these learned men, two Greek historians stand out, each offering a different answer to the riddle of Etruscan origins. Their theories, written down more than 2,000 years ago, continue to shape our understanding of this enigmatic people even today. The first of these scholars was Herodotus, known to later generations as the father of history. In his great work chronicling the conflicts between East and West, he paused to tell a story that had been passed down through generations of storytellers. According to Herodotus, the Etruscans were not native to the Italian peninsula at all, but had arrived there as refugees from a distant land across the sea. Let your imagination carry you back to the ancient kingdom of Lydia, in what we now call Turkey. This was a realm of legendary wealth, where the first coins were minted and where King Croesus accumulated riches so vast that his name became synonymous with prosperity. But even in this land of plenty, disaster could strike. Herodotus tells us of a terrible famine that gripped Lydia, lasting for 18 long years. The people grew desperate as their stores of grain dwindled and their herds died from lack of pasture. The Lydian king, facing the possible extinction of his people, made a difficult decision. He would divide his subjects into two groups. One half would remain in Lydia, hoping to survive the famine on what little food remained. The other half would take to the sea, seeking new lands where they might establish a new home. To lead this great migration, the king chose his own son, Prince Tyrrhenus, a young man known for his wisdom and courage. Imagine the scene as this great expedition prepared to depart. Ships were loaded with the most precious possessions of the Lydian court, bronze vessels and jewelry, weapons and tools, sacred objects and family treasures. Women and children said tearful farewells to relatives they might never see again, while men took solemn oaths to establish a new kingdom worthy of their ancestors. The voyage was long and perilous, taking Prince Tyrrhenus and his followers across the wine-dark waters of the Mediterranean. They sailed past the islands of the Aegean, along the coast of Greece, and around the southern tip of Italy. Finally, they reached the western shores of central Italy, where they found a land that seemed to welcome them with open arms. The hills were green with vegetation, the soil was rich and fertile, and the native peoples were few and scattered. Here, according to Herodotus, Prince Tyrrhenus and his followers established themselves as the Tyrrhenians, taking their name from there. Royal leader. They built cities on the hilltops, established trading relationships with their neighbors, and slowly transformed themselves into the people we know as the Etruscans. The very sea that bordered their new homeland was called the Tyrrhenian Sea. In their honor, a name it bears to this day. But even in the ancient world, not everyone accepted this romantic tale of royal refugees and heroic migration. Another Greek historian, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, offered a very different explanation for Etruscan origins. According to his careful research, the Etruscans were not foreigners at all, but were indigenous to the Italian peninsula. They were, he argued, the direct descendants of the people who had lived in central Italy for many generations, their sophisticated culture developing naturally from the simple farming communities of the Bronze Age. Dionysius pointed to the deep roots that Etruscan culture had sunk into Italian soil. Their religious practices, he noted, were closely tied to the natural features of the landscape. Their cities were built with an intimate knowledge of local geology and geography. Their agricultural techniques were perfectly adapted to the Mediterranean climate of central Italy. All of this, he argued, suggested a people who had lived in this region for centuries, not recent arrivals from a distant land. Yet even as these ancient historians debated the question of Etruscan origins, another theory began to emerge from the mists of the late Bronze Age. This was the time of the Great Collapse, when the sophisticated civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean suddenly crumbled into dust. Mighty empires that had dominated the region for centuries simply vanished. Their cities burned and abandoned, their people scattered to the winds. Among the causes of this great catastrophe were the mysterious sea peoples, warrior bands who swept across the Mediterranean like a devastating storm. These were not the organized armies of traditional conquest, but rather confederations of displaced peoples, driven from their homes by drought, famine, or invasion. They traveled in great fleets of ships, carrying with them not just weapons and warriors, but entire families seeking new homes. The sea peoples left a trail of destruction across the ancient world. They attacked the Hittite Empire, bringing down one of the great powers of the Bronze Age. They invaded Cyprus and the Levant, destroying cities and disrupting trade routes that had existed for generations. They even dared to challenge the might of Egypt itself, though the pharaohs ultimately managed to repel their invasions. Could it be that among these sea peoples were the ancestors of the Etruscans? Some scholars have suggested that bands of displaced warriors and their families, driven from their homes in the eastern Mediterranean, eventually found their way to the shores of central Italy. There, they would have encountered the indigenous peoples of the region, perhaps intermarrying with them and gradually creating the unique culture that we recognize as Etruscan. This theory would explain many of the puzzling aspects of Etruscan civilization. Their advanced maritime technology, their knowledge of metalworking, their sophisticated religious practices, all could have been brought from the older civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, their deep connection to the Italian landscape and their successful adaptation to local conditions would reflect the influence of indigenous peoples who had lived in the region for generations. In our modern age, we have tools that the ancient historians could never have imagined. Scientists can now peer into the very building blocks of human heredity, reading the genetic codes that have been passed down through countless generations. These molecular archaeologists have turned their attention to the question of Etruscan origins, hoping to find in DNA the answers that have eluded scholars for centuries. The results of these genetic studies have been both fascinating and frustrating. Some research suggests connections between the Etruscans and Anatolia going back some 5,000 years, much further back than the supposed migration recorded by Herodotus. Other studies conclude that the observed genetic similarities between modern Tuscans and Anatolians cannot be attributed to an immigration wave from the east, leading to the onset of the Etruscan culture in Italy. The genetic evidence suggests a truth that is more complex than any single theory can explain. The Etruscans appear to have been neither purely foreign immigrants nor purely indigenous Italians, but rather a people whose ancestry reflects the complex movements of populations that characterized the ancient Mediterranean world. They were, in essence, a synthesis of different peoples and cultures, brought together by the currents of history to create something entirely new. Perhaps we should imagine the origins of the Etruscans not as a single dramatic event, but as a gradual process, unfolding over many generations. Picture small groups of migrants arriving in central Italy at different times and from different places. Some might have been traders from the eastern Mediterranean, attracted by the region's mineral wealth. Others could have been refugees from the upheavals of the late Bronze Age collapse. Still others might have been adventurers and colonists, seeking new opportunities in the West. These newcomers would have encountered indigenous peoples, who had their own rich traditions and deep knowledge of the land. Over time, through intermarriage and cultural exchange, these different groups would have blended together, creating a unique synthesis that combined the best of both worlds. The result was a people who possessed the sophisticated knowledge of the Eastern Mediterranean civilizations while maintaining a deep connection to the Italian landscape and its rhythms. This process of cultural fusion would explain many of the distinctive features of Etruscan civilization. Their language, for instance, seems to have been non-Indo-European, suggesting connections to the ancient languages of Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet their religious practices show clear adaptations to the Italian environment, with elaborate rituals designed to read the will of the gods in the natural phenomena of their adopted homeland. Their art, too, reflects this synthesis of influences. Early Etruscan pottery shows clear Greek influence, suggesting contact with the wider Mediterranean world. Yet the subject matter of their paintings and sculptures is distinctly Italian, focused on themes of daily life, hunting, and the natural world of central Italy. Their metalwork combines Eastern Mediterranean techniques with distinctly local artistic traditions. Even their approach to urban planning reflects this blending of influences. Etruscan cities were laid out according to sophisticated principles of design that may have originated in the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet they were also carefully adapted to the specific topography of the Italian hills, taking advantage of natural defensive positions and water sources that could only have been known through intimate familiarity with the local landscape. As we ponder these various theories of Etruscan origins, we might find ourselves thinking of the great rivers that flow through central Italy. The Tiber and the Arno, the Ombrone and the Cesena, all begin as small streams high in the mountains, gathering strength as they flow toward the sea. Along the way, they are joined by countless tributaries, each adding its own character to the growing river. By the time they reach the Mediterranean, they have become something entirely new, a synthesis of all the waters that have joined them on their journey. So too, perhaps with the Etruscans. They were not a single people with a single origin, but rather a confluence of different streams of humanity, brought together by the currents of history to create something unique and powerful. Their civilization was not the product of a single migration or a single indigenous development, but rather the result of a complex process of cultural fusion that unfolded over many generations. This understanding makes the Etruscans no less mysterious, but perhaps more human. They were not some exotic people from a distant land, nor were they simple farmers who suddenly developed sophisticated culture. They were, instead, the product of the same processes that have shaped human civilization throughout history: migration and settlement, cultural exchange and adaptation, the endless human quest for a better life in a new land. As we stand here in the gathering dusk of ancient Etruria, we can almost see the ghosts of those first settlers making their way through. The hills. Some carry the weathered faces of long sea voyages, their eyes holding memories of distant shores. Others bear the sun-darkened features of those who have worked this soil for generations, their hands skilled in the ancient arts of farming and herding. All of them, newcomers and natives alike, are united by a common vision, the dream of creating something lasting and beautiful in this favored corner of the ancient world. The truth of Etruscan origins may never be fully known. Like the language they spoke, it remains partially hidden from us, revealed only in tantalizing fragments. But perhaps this mystery is part of their enduring appeal. In a world where so much seems certain and explained, the Etruscans remind us that the past still holds secrets, still whispers to us in voices we can hear, but not quite understand. Asterisk for now. As the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky above ancient Etruria, let us rest in the knowledge that the question of origins is, in the end, less important than the civilization that emerged from whatever combination of peoples and cultures came together in these hills. Whether they came from Anatolia or the sea, whether they were indigenous Italians or Eastern Mediterranean refugees, the Etruscans created something remarkable and lasting, something that would influence the course of Western civilization for centuries to come. Sleep peacefully, and let your dreams carry you across the wine-dark waters of the ancient Mediterranean, where the great currents of human migration and cultural exchange have always flowed, bringing together peoples from distant shores to create new chapters in the endless story of human civilization. As dawn breaks over the ancient hills of Etruria, imagine yourself walking through the ruins of a long-forgotten cemetery. The morning light filters through the cypress trees, casting dancing shadows on weathered stone monuments that had stood here for more than 2 millennia. Each tomb, each carved inscription, each carefully crafted funeral urn whispers to us across the centuries, but in a language that remains tantalizingly just beyond our complete understanding. Picture yourself pausing before one of these ancient stones, its surface covered with carefully carved letters that seem almost familiar, yet somehow foreign. The alphabet looks remarkably like the one you learned as a child, with letters that would eventually become our own A, B, C, and D. Yet the words they form, the messages they convey, remain wrapped in mystery, like voices heard from a distant room whose meaning we can only partially grasp. The Etruscan language presents us with one of the most intriguing puzzles in all of archaeology. The texts can be read. They always could be read because the Etruscan alphabetic script is derived from a West Greek model. The problem is that we do not know much about how the Etruscan language works. It is as if we have been given a beautiful piece of music, but can only read the notes without understanding the melody they create together. Then 10,000 Etruscan inscriptions have been found on tombstones, vases, statues, mirrors, and jewelry. Each one represents a voice from the past, a person who lived and loved, hoped and dreamed in these ancient hills. Yet their words come to us across the centuries, like whispers in a language we have largely forgotten. The story of the Etruscan alphabet begins with the great trading networks of the ancient Mediterranean. Picture the bustling harbors of the 7th century BCE, where merchant ships from Greece arrived laden with wine, oil, and pottery. Among the most precious cargo they carried was something invisible yet invaluable, the gift of written language. The Greeks had adapted their alphabet from the Phoenicians, who had themselves refined it from earlier Semitic scripts. Now, this powerful tool of communication was about to undergo another transformation. The Etruscans, with their keen eye for useful innovation, quickly recognized the value of this Greek alphabet. But they were not content to simply copy it unchanged. Instead, they adapted it to serve their own unique linguistic needs, creating something that was both familiar and distinctly their own. Etruscan was written in an alphabet derived from the Greek alphabet. This alphabet was the source of the Latin alphabet, as well as other alphabets in Italy and probably beyond. The earliest known example of Etruscan writing comes to us from the town of Marsiliana d'Albegna, where archaeologists discovered a remarkable ivory tablet dating to around 700 BCE, the earliest known Etruscan. A Abecedarium is inscribed on the frame of a wax tablet in ivory, measuring 8.8 centimeters, 5 centimeters, 3.5 in times 2 in. Found at Marsiliana, this tiny object, no larger than a modern smartphone, represents one of humanity's great leaps forward in communication. Imagine the careful work of the craftsman who carved this alphabet into the ivory, each letter formed with precision and care. This was not merely a writing exercise, but a sacred act of preserving knowledge, of ensuring that the sounds of human speech could be captured and transmitted across time and space. The letters march across the ivory surface in neat rows, each one a symbol of the Etruscans' determination to master this new technology of literacy. But the Etruscans did not simply adopt the Greek alphabet without modification. They made changes that reflected the unique characteristics of their own language. The Etruscans wrote right to left, and many of the Greek letters are reversed in orientation. This right-to-left writing system, called retrograde, gives Etruscan inscriptions a distinctive appearance that sets them apart from their Greek and later Roman counterparts. Picture an Etruscan scribe at work, carefully carving letters into stone or bronze. His hand moved from right to left across the surface, each letter formed as a mirror image of what we might expect. To our eyes, accustomed to left-to-right writing, these inscriptions seem to flow backward, as if time itself were moving in reverse. Like the alphabets of the Middle East and the early forms of the Greek alphabet, the Etruscan script was usually written from right to left, but occasionally appears in boustrophedon style, i.e., the direction of writing alternates with each line. Right dash to dash, left slash left dash to dash, right closing parenthesis dot. The word boustrophedon comes from the Greek words meaning as the ox turns, referring to the way a farmer plows a field, turning at the end of each furrow to begin the next row in the opposite direction. Some early Etruscan inscriptions follow this pattern, with alternating lines reading right to left and left to right. Imagine the rhythm of reading such a text, your eyes moving back and forth across the stone like a shuttle on a loom, weaving together. The threads of ancient meaning. The Etruscan language itself remains one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. Unlike Latin, Greek, or Germanic languages, Etruscan does not belong to the Indo-European family of languages that gave rise to most modern European tongues. Instead, it stands alone, a linguistic island in the Mediterranean, its origins and relationships still debated by scholars. What we do know comes from careful analysis of those thousands of inscriptions scattered across central Italy. The vast majority of these texts are brief, often no more than a few words, recording the name of the deceased on a tomb or the dedication of a votive offering in a temple. These short inscriptions are like fragments of conversation heard in passing, giving us glimpses into the lives of ancient people without revealing the full story of their thoughts and experiences. The longest Etruscan text we possess is written on linen cloth that was used to wrap an Egyptian mummy, now housed in the museum in Zagreb, Croatia. This remarkable document, known as the Zagreb mummy cloth or Liber Lentius, contains more than 1,300 words arranged in columns across the ancient fabric. Scholars believe it is a religious calendar, listing the rituals and ceremonies that marked the sacred year in an Etruscan city. Yet even this extensive text remains largely mysterious, its meaning emerging only in fragments and educated guesses. Imagine unrolling this ancient cloth, its surface covered with the careful script of a long-dead priest or priestess. Each column represents a month or season, each line a sacred duty or ritual observance. We can identify some words, numbers, names of gods, terms for sacrifice and offering. but the overall meaning remains elusive, like trying to understand a complex piece of music when you can only hear a few scattered notes. The breakthrough that scholars had long hoped for came in 1964 when archaeologists working near the coastal town of Pyrgi made one of the most important discoveries in the history of Etruscan studies. Found in 1964 near the town of Pyrgi in Italy, these tablets date back to around the 5th century BCE. They hold immense historical importance because they provide one of the few bilingual texts in Etruscan and Phoenician, offering valuable insights into both languages. Picture the excitement of the archaeologists as they uncovered these golden tablets, their surfaces gleaming in the Mediterranean sun after more than 2 millennia buried in the earth. The text records the foundation of a temple and its dedication to the Phoenician goddess Astarte, who is identified with the Etruscan supreme goddess Uni in the Etruscan text. The temple's construction is attributed to Theferi Velianus, ruler of the nearby city of Kaware. The importance of these tablets cannot be overstated. The tablets allow researchers to use the Phoenician version to read and interpret the otherwise undecipherable Etruscan. For the first time, scholars had a Rosetta Stone for the Etruscan language, a key that might unlock the secrets of this ancient tongue. Yet even with this bilingual text, the Etruscan language has not yielded all its secrets. The Pyrgi tablets, while invaluable, deal with a specific religious and political situation. They tell us about the dedication of a temple, the relationship between Etruscan and Phoenician deities, and the diplomatic connections between these ancient Mediterranean peoples. But they do not provide the comprehensive understanding of Etruscan grammar and vocabulary that scholars had hoped for. The challenge of understanding Etruscan is compounded by the nature of the texts that have survived. The vast majority of Etruscan inscriptions are funerary, brief epitaphs carved on tombs and sarcophagi. These texts follow formulaic patterns, typically giving the name of the deceased, their age at death, and perhaps the names of their parents or spouse. While these inscriptions have allowed scholars to understand something of Etruscan naming practices and family relationships, they provide little insight into the everyday language of Etruscan life. Consider the typical Etruscan tomb inscription, Vel Sperina Larth Clan Avils XXX. Through careful analysis of hundreds of such texts, scholars have determined that this formula identifies Vel Sperina, son of Larth, who died at the age of 30. But this bare skeleton of information tells us nothing about who Vel Sperina was, what he did for a living, what he believed, or how he lived his life. The person behind the name remains as mysterious as the language itself. The problem is made more complex by the fact that Etruscan, like all languages, was not static. It evolved and changed over the centuries with regional dialects and historical variations that make it difficult to establish consistent rules of grammar and vocabulary. The Etruscan of the 7th century BC was not the same as the Etruscan of the 3rd century BCE, just as the English of Chaucer's time differs markedly from the English of today. Furthermore, the Etruscan language appears to have been gradually replaced by Latin as Rome's influence spread throughout central Italy. By the 1st century BCE, Etruscan was primarily a ceremonial language, used in religious rituals and formal inscriptions, but no longer spoken in the homes and marketplaces of Etruscan cities. The last known Etruscan inscription dates to the 2nd century CE, marking the end of a linguistic tradition that had endured for nearly a millennium. Despite these challenges, scholars have made remarkable progress in understanding Etruscan. They have identified hundreds of words, worked out the basic number system, and begun to understand the structure of Etruscan names and family relationships. They know that Etruscan society was organized around powerful family groups, that women held a higher status than in most ancient cultures, and that religion played a central role in daily life. The Etruscan numbering system, for instance, has been largely deciphered through careful analysis of tomb inscriptions and other texts. The word Mach means one, Zal means two, and Psi means three. Higher numbers follow recognizable patterns, allowing scholars to understand references to ages, dates, and quantities in Etruscan texts. This may seem like a small victory, but it represents a genuine breakthrough in understanding how the Etruscan mind organized and expressed numerical concepts. Similarly, the structure of Etruscan names has become clear through analysis of family. Tomb inscriptions. Etruscans typically had two names, a personal name and a family name. Women retained their family names after marriage, a practice that was unusual in the ancient world and suggests a more egalitarian approach to family relationships. The use of patronymic and matronymic markers allows scholars to trace family relationships across generations, creating a picture of Etruscan society that is remarkably detailed for such an ancient period. Religious terminology represents another area where scholars have made significant progress. Words like flamen, priest, haruspex, diviner, and augur, interpreter of omens, appear frequently in Etruscan texts and were later adopted into Latin. These borrowings suggest that the Romans learned much of their religious practice from the Etruscans, confirming what historical sources tell us about Etruscan influence on early Roman culture. Yet for all these advances, the Etruscan language remains tantalizingly incomplete in our understanding. We can read the words, but we cannot always understand what they mean. We can identify the structure of sentences, but we cannot always follow the flow of ideas. It is as if we were listening to a conversation in a foreign language, catching familiar words and phrases, but missing the deeper meaning that connects them into coherent thought. This partial understanding gives Etruscan inscriptions a poetic quality that is both beautiful and frustrating. Take, for example, the inscription on the famous Pyrgi tablets, Uni me theferi velianas, sau cluvinias turis unistus, thuvas tamaresca, elecf tuleres. We know that this relates to the goddess Uni and the ruler Theferi Velianas, but the exact meaning of the surrounding words remains uncertain. The inscription speaks to us across the centuries, but in a voice that is muffled by time and linguistic change. Perhaps this mystery is part of the enduring appeal of the Etruscan language. In our modern world, where so much seems explained and categorized, the Etruscan inscriptions remind us that there are still secrets waiting to be discovered, still voices from the past that we have not fully learned to hear. They challenge us to be patient, to listen carefully, and to remember that understanding sometimes comes not all at once, but gradually. Like the slow dawning of light on a misty morning got, the work of deciphering Etruscan continues today with scholars around the world applying new techniques and technologies to the ancient texts. Computer analysis allows them to identify patterns and connections that might not be apparent to the human eye. New archaeological discoveries continue to add to the corpus of known Etruscan texts, each one potentially containing the key to unlocking another piece of the linguistic puzzle. As we stand here in the gathering dusk among the ancient tombs of Etruria, we can almost hear the whispers of the Etruscan language floating on the evening breeze. The words may be partially lost to us, but their emotional content remains clear. Here was a people who loved their families, honored their gods, and faced death with dignity and hope. Their language may be mysterious, but their humanity speaks to us across the centuries with unmistakable clarity. The gentle mist rises from the Tyrrhenian coast as dawn breaks over the ancient hills of Etruria. In the distance, the soft outlines of cities emerge from the morning haze, not the rigid, militaristic strongholds we might expect, but something altogether more remarkable, something uniquely Etruscan. Picture, if you will, the rolling landscape of central Italy in the 7th century before Christ. The Romans are still a collection of small settlements along the Tiber, dreaming perhaps of conquest, but not yet the masters of the Mediterranean. Here, in the lands we now call Tuscany and northern Lazio, a different kind of civilization flourishes. One that thinks cooperation over domination, trade over tribute, and community over conquest. The Etruscans, those mysterious people whose origins we explored in our earlier wanderings, had discovered something that would prove both their greatest strength and perhaps their ultimate vulnerability. They had learned to build not an empire, but a confederation, a loose alliance of independent city-states that shared culture, language, and trade, but jealously guarded their individual sovereignty. At the heart of this confederation lay the Dodecapolis, the 12 cities. The name itself comes from the Greek, meaning simply 12 cities, and while the exact roster of these cities changed over the centuries, their importance never wavered. Think of them as pearls strung along the Italian coast and hills, each one gleaming with its own particular brilliance, yet connected by invisible threads of commerce, culture, and shared identity. Tarquinia, which the Etruscans called Tarchna, stood perhaps as the most illustrious of these pearls. Perched on its plateau overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, Tarquinia was where kings were crowned and prophecies were made. Its necropolis, that vast city of the dead we shall visit later, tells us that this was a place of extraordinary wealth and artistic achievement. The merchants of Tarquinia traded with Greeks across the Mediterranean, bringing back not just goods, but ideas, stories, and artistic techniques that would transform Etruscan culture. As we move inland from Tarquinia, our imaginary journey takes us to Veii, known to the Etruscans as Veia. This city controlled the salt trade along the Tiber River, and its strategic position made it both wealthy and, eventually, fatally attractive to the growing power of Rome. Veii was a city of engineers and builders, whose inhabitants carved channels through solid rock to drain marshlands and created some of the earliest sophisticated urban planning in the ancient world. Further south, we encounter Cerveteri, the Etruscan Caestra or Cara. This coastal city became the gateway between Etruscan lands and the wider Mediterranean world. Its port welcomed ships from Egypt, laden with ivory and exotic goods, and from the Baltic regions, carrying precious amber that would adorn the necks of Etruscan nobles. Cerveteri was cosmopolitan in a way that few ancient cities achieved. A melting pot where different cultures blended and influenced each other. The Confederation worked in ways that seem almost modern to our contemporary eyes. Each city maintained its independence, governing itself according to local customs and needs. There was no emperor, no central authority dictating policy from a distant capital. Instead, the cities came together at regular intervals at a place called the Fanum Voltumnae, the sanctuary of Voltumna, the chief deity of the Etruscan pantheon. Imagine these gatherings, if you will. Representatives from the 12 cities would arrive at the sacred sanctuary, probably located near present-day Orvieto. They came not as subjects reporting to a master, but as equals meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest. Trade agreements would be negotiated, disputes settled, and religious festivals celebrated. The language of these meetings was Etruscan, binding the cities together with words that carried the weight of centuries of shared tradition. This loose confederation allowed for remarkable diversity within unity. While Tarquinia might excel in religious matters and prophecy, Populonia, with its proximity to the iron-rich island of Elba, became the Confederation's center for metallurgy and metalworking. Volterra, perched high in the hills, controlled the alabaster trade and became renowned for its skilled craftsmen. Each city developed its own specialties, its own character, while remaining unmistakably Etruscan. The system worked because it was flexible. Cities could join or leave the Confederation as circumstances changed. When external threats emerged, such as the expanding Celtic tribes from the north or the growing Roman power from the south, the cities could coordinate their response. When times were peaceful, they could focus on trade and cultural exchange. It was a system that prized adaptation over rigidity, cooperation over coercion. Trade was the lifeblood of this confederation. The Etruscans were, above all, a commercial people. Their ships carried Etruscan iron and bronze worked to markets across the Mediterranean, returning with Greek pottery, Egyptian artifacts, and exotic goods from distant lands. The cities of the Confederation were connected by more than just political agreements. They were bound together by trade routes that carried not just goods, but ideas, artistic influences, and cultural innovations. Consider the sophistication of their commercial networks. Etruscan merchants established trading posts in southern France, Spain, and North Africa. They had commercial agreements with Greek city-states and were respected partners in the complex web of Mediterranean commerce. The Confederation's success was built on their understanding that prosperity came not from conquest and tribute, but from mutually beneficial exchange. Yet this strength would also prove to be their weakness. The very independence that each city cherished would make it difficult for them to present a united front when faced with the disciplined, militaristic expansion of Rome. The Romans, with their different model of governance, one that demanded complete submission from conquered peoples, would prove more effective at creating lasting political unity. But in the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ, as we rest in our imaginary observation point overlooking the Etruscan lands, such concerns seemed far away. The Confederation was at its height, its cities prosperous and influential. Etruscan culture was spreading throughout Italy, influencing the development of Roman civilization in ways that would echo through the centuries. As evening approaches in our journey through ancient Etruria, we can almost hear the sounds of these bustling cities, the ring of bronze hammers in the workshops of Populonia, the chanting of priests in the temples of Tarquinia, the calls of merchants in the markets of Cerveteri. Each city had its own rhythm, its own character, yet all were part of the same great symphony of Etruscan civilization. The Confederation of the Etruscans reminds us that there are different ways to organize human societies. Not every successful civilization needs to be built on domination and conquest. The Etruscans showed that cooperation, trade, and cultural exchange could create societies of remarkable sophistication and prosperity. Their model of loose confederation, allowing for local autonomy within a broader cultural unity, would influence political thinking for centuries to come. As the stars begin to appear over the ancient hills of Etruria, we can reflect on the wisdom of this approach. In our modern world, with its complex international relationships and global challenges, perhaps there is something to be learned from the Etruscan model, the understanding that strength can come from cooperation, that prosperity can be built on mutual benefit, and that unity does not require uniformity. The 12 cities of the Etruscan Confederation were more than just political entities. They were laboratories of culture, centers of learning, and nodes in a network of human connection that stretched across the ancient world. In their rise and eventual fall, they remind us that civilizations, like individuals, each have their own character, their own approach to the challenges of existence. In our continued journey through the mysterious world of the Etruscans, we will descend into their painted tombs, where death was not feared but celebrated, where the afterlife was imagined as a continuation of the pleasures of this world. But for now, as we rest in the gentle darkness of the Tuscan hills, we can appreciate the achievement of these ancient people who community over conquest, cooperation over domination. The wind whispers through the ancient olive trees, carrying with it the echoes of voices long silenced, the memory of a civilization that dared to be different. In that whisper, we hear the enduring lesson of the Etruscan Confederation, that there are many ways to build a society, many paths to prosperity, and that sometimes the gentlest approach proves the most enduring. Descending into the painted chambers beneath the earth, we leave behind our modern anxieties about mortality and enter a world where death was not an ending, but a transformation. Here, in the underground galleries of Tarquinia and Cerveteri. The Etruscans painted their most profound beliefs about life, death, and what lies beyond. The morning sun filters through the cypress trees of the Monterazzi necropolis, casting long shadows across the ancient burial grounds of Tarquinia. Somewhere beneath our feet, in chambers carved from living rock over 2 millennia ago, extraordinary scenes unfold on walls that have known only for darkness centuries. These are the painted tombs of the Etruscans, and they tell a story unlike any other in the ancient world. To understand these remarkable underground galleries, we must first abandon our contemporary relationship with death. In our modern world, death often comes with fear, solemnity, and separation from the joys of life. The Etruscans viewed it differently. For them, death was not the opposite of life, but its continuation in another realm. The afterlife was not a place of judgment or suffering, but a space where the pleasures of earthly existence could continue unabated. This philosophy is written in vivid colors across the walls of their tombs. Due to this belief in a continuation of vitality after death, many Etruscan tombs were painted in scenes of banquets and dancing, or of the favorite activities and moments in the deceased's life. When we enter these underground chambers, we do not find somber reminders of mortality, but celebrations of life that continue beyond the grave. Let us begin our journey in the Tomb of the Leopards, one of the most famous painted chambers in Tarquinia. Dating to around 470 BCE, this small underground room explodes with color and movement. The walls depict an elaborate banquet scene, but this is no ordinary dinner party. The guests recline on layers, following the Greek symposium tradition, but the atmosphere is distinctly Etruscan. Men and women feast together, something that would have been scandalous in contemporary Athens or Rome. The scenes give an important insight into social status, as they show that Etruscan women could attend drinking parties when their counterparts in Greece could not. The banqueters hold cups of wine aloft, their faces painted with expressions of joy and contentment. Musicians play the double flute and lyre, their melodies almost audible across the centuries. Servants move between the layers, carrying amphorae of wine and platters of food. Above them all, 2 spotted leopards, the tomb's namesakes, prowl along the triangular pediment, not as threatening predators, but as symbols of the wild energy of life itself. The genius of these paintings lies not just in their artistic execution, but in their psychological insight. In the Etruscan mindset, the afterlife was perceived as a Dionysian dimension of dance and joy. The tomb becomes a stage where the deceased can continue to participate in the social pleasures that define their earthly existence. Death, in this context, is not a loss, but a transformation into a realm where the constraints of mortality no longer apply. Moving deeper into the necropolis, we encounter the tomb of the triclinium, where the banquet theme reaches even greater heights of artistic achievement. Here, the walls come alive with dancers, whose movements seem to flow from one wall to the next. A young man plays the double flute while another dances with abandon, his cloak billowing behind him. The rhythm is infectious, the joy palpable. Even in death, the Etruscans refuse to be still. But these are not merely scenes of earthly pleasure projected into the afterlife. They are sophisticated theological statements about the nature of existence itself. The banquets depicted in these tombs serve multiple purposes. The funeral banquet not only sends the deceased off to the afterlife, but also reinforced ties and status, reminders among the community of the living. The paintings commemorate both the life that was lived and the life that continues, creating a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The Tomb of the Lionesses presents another facet of Etruscan funerary art. Here, the focus shifts from human celebration to the natural world. The Tomb of the Lionesses, dating back to the 4th century, is decorated with a painting depicting flying birds and leaping dolphins. in scenes depicting the life of the Etruscan aristocracy. The lionesses themselves, painted on the rear wall, are not fearsome beasts, but elegant creatures that seem to dance through their painted landscape. Birds soar across the ceiling, dolphins leap through stylized waves, and the entire chamber becomes a celebration of the natural world's vitality. The artistic technique employed in these tombs reveals the sophistication of Etruscan culture. Painters were not merely decorators, but skilled artists who understood perspective, movement, and emotional expression. They painted directly onto the rough-hewn rock walls, using techniques that would influence Roman wall painting for centuries to come. The colors, deep reds, brilliant blues, warm yellows, were created from mineral pigments that have retained their vibrancy through more than 2 millennia. These painted chambers also reveal the remarkable social equality that characterized Etruscan society. In the banquet scenes, we see not just the wealthy elite, but servants, musicians, and entertainers, all painted with the same care and attention to detail. The message is clear. In the Etruscan afterlife, all who contributed to life's joy were welcome at the eternal feast. The evolution of these tomb paintings over several centuries tells the story of changing attitudes toward death and the afterlife. The earliest paintings from the 6th century BCE are exuberant and optimistic, filled with scenes of dancing, feasting, and natural beauty. As Etruscan political power waned and Roman influence grew, the paintings became more complex, sometimes incorporating elements of Greek mythology and occasionally showing darker themes related to death and the underworld. One of the most haunting examples of this later period is the Tomb of the Blue Demons, dating to around 400 BCE. Here, we see a rare glimpse of the Etruscan conception of the underworld, complete with demonic figures painted in vivid blue. Yet even in this more somber context, the human figures maintain their dignity, and the overall composition suggests transformation rather than punishment. The painted tombs of Cerveteri offer a different perspective on Etruscan funerary art. While Tarquinia's tombs are famous for their wall paintings, Cerveteri's Banditascia necropolis is renowned for its architectural innovation. Here, entire underground neighborhoods were carved from rock, creating cities of the dead that mirrored the cities of the living. The tombs are arranged along streets, with different architectural styles representing different periods and social classes. The Tomb of the Reliefs at Cerveteri takes a different approach to commemorating the dead. Instead of paintings, the walls are covered with stucco reliefs depicting the possessions and pleasures of life, hunting weapons, household implements, pets, and even pillows and cushions. The message is the same as in the painted tombs. The afterlife includes all the comforts and pleasures of earthly existence. These funeral arts reveal something profound about Etruscan psychology and spirituality. In a world where most ancient cultures viewed death as a journey to a shadowy, diminished existence, the Etruscans imagined it as an enhancement of life. The grave goods found in these tombs point to the Etruscan belief in an afterlife that required the same types of goods and materials as in the world of the living. The tombs were furnished with everything the deceased might need: furniture, jewelry, weapons, games, and vast quantities of pottery for storing food and wine. The impact of these painted tombs extends far beyond their immediate cultural context. They represent one of the earliest and most sophisticated attempts to visualize the afterlife in Western art. The tradition of decorating burial chambers with scenes of earthly life would influence Roman art, and through Rome, the entire development of Western artistic tradition. When we visit the catacombs of early Christian Rome or admire the frescoed chapels of Renaissance Italy, we are seeing the distant descendants of these Etruscan innovations. As we emerge from our imaginary journey through these underground galleries, we carry with us a transformed understanding of death and memory. The Etruscans created these painted chambers, not as monuments to loss, but as celebrations of continuity. They refused to accept death as an ending, instead imagining it as a graduation into a realm where life's pleasures could be enjoyed without the constraints of mortality. The painted tombs speak to something universal in human experience: the desire to be remembered, to continue, to find meaning in the face of mortality. The Etruscans' response to this universal challenge was to create art that bridges the gap between life and death, that makes the invisible visible, that transforms fear into celebration. In our contemporary world, where death is often hidden, away, sanitized, and removed from daily experience, these ancient painted chambers offer a different model. They suggest that death might be met not with fear, but with the same joy and celebration that characterizes life at its best. They remind us that memory is a form of immortality, that art can preserve not just the appearance of life, but its essential spirit. The wind whispers through the cypress trees, and in that whisper we hear the echo of ancient laughter, the distant sound of music, and the eternal invitation to join the feast that death cannot end. In the gentle twilight of ancient Etruria, as the evening meal draws to a close, we witness something that would have shocked the civilized world of Greece and Rome. A woman rises from her dining couch, not to retire to hidden chambers, but to join the conversation, to offer her opinion, to participate as an equal in the intellectual and social life of her community. This is the world of Etruscan women, a world of unprecedented freedom, education, and dignity. The status of women in ancient societies offers us one of the clearest windows into the values and character of the civilization. In this regard, the Etruscans stand apart from their Mediterranean contemporaries like a beacon of progressive thought in an otherwise restrictive world. While in both Greece and Republican Rome, respectable women were mostly confined to the house and mixed-sex socializing did not occur, Etruscan women moved freely through society, participated in public life, and enjoyed rights that their Greek and Roman sisters could only dream of. To understand the remarkable nature of Etruscan women's status, we must first consider the world they inhabited. Picture, if you will, a typical evening in Athens during the 5th century BCE. As the sun sets over the Acropolis, the men of the household prepare for their symposium, an evening of wine, philosophical discussion, and entertainment. The women of the family, however, retreat to the gynekien, the women's quarters, where they will spend their evening in seclusion, forbidden from participating in the intellectual and social life of their male relatives. Now transport yourself to a similar evening in an Etruscan city, perhaps Tarquinia or Cerveteri. Here, as the bronze lamps are lit and the wine is poured, we see an entirely different scene. Husband and wife recline together on the same dining couch, a sight that would have scandalized both Greeks and Romans. Women were respected in Etruscan society compared to their ancient Greek and Roman counterparts, and this respect was not merely ceremonial, but practical and profound. The archaeological evidence for women's elevated status in Etruscan society is overwhelming. In the painted tombs we visited in our previous journey, we consistently see men and women dining together, participating equally in the social rituals that define Etruscan life. The famous sarcophagus of the spouses from Cerveteri, dating to around 520 BCE, shows a husband and wife reclining together in eternal companionship. Both figures carved with equal dignity and affection. Records show that Etruscan women were literate and enjoyed greater legal rights. 2. In Etruria, a woman could inherit family property if there were no surviving male line. Not so in Greece. Property ownership and the right to drink wine is additionally proven by graffiti on pottery. This literacy was not decorative merely, but practical. Etruscan women were active participants in commerce, religion, and politics. The legal rights of Etruscan women extended far beyond what was common in the ancient world. while a Roman woman remained under the legal guardianship of her father or husband throughout her life, and a Greek woman had virtually no legal standing at all. Etruscan women could own property, conduct business, and make legal decisions independently. Inscriptions found throughout Etruria record women as dedicants of religious offerings, owners of property, and even as magistrates in some cities. The freedom of Etruscan women was so remarkable that it became a source of fascination and, often, moral outrage among their Greek and Roman neighbors. Greek writers like Theopompus wrote scandalous accounts of Etruscan women's behavior, describing their participation in banquets and their freedom of movement as evidence of moral corruption. The freedom of women within Etruscan society could have been misunderstood as implying their sexual availability by observers from more restrictive cultures. But these criticisms tell us more about the prejudices of the critics than about the reality of Etruscan women's lives. The archaeological evidence suggests that Etruscan women's freedom was embedded in a sophisticated social structure that valued balance, cooperation, and mutual respect between the sexes. Rather than leading to social chaos, this equality seems to have contributed to the stability and prosperity of Etruscan civilization. The religious life of the Etruscans offers another window into women's elevated status. Unlike in Greece and Rome, where women's religious roles were often limited to specific festivals or cults, Etruscan women participated fully in religious life. They served as priestesses, made offerings to the gods, and participated in the complex divination practices that were central to Etruscan culture. Some scholars believe that women may have had special roles in the interpretation of omens and prophecies, skills that were highly valued in Etruscan society. The story of Tanaquil, this legendary Etruscan woman who became Queen of Rome, illustrates the power and influence that Etruscan women could wield. Tanaquil is depicted as an intelligent and ambitious woman whose background likely afforded her high status. She played a crucial role in several key events, including their relocation to Rome, where she interpreted significant omens that foreshadowed her husband's rise to power. Tanaquil was the reason her husband and her son-in-law became the first two Etruscan kings of Rome. Tanaquil's story is particularly significant because it shows how Etruscan women's education and skills were valued, even beyond their own society. Her ability to interpret omens and her political acumen were not seen as inappropriate for a woman, but as valuable assets that contributed to her family's success and, ultimately, to the founding of Roman royal power. The education of Etruscan women was another area where they differed dramatically from their contemporaries. While Greek and Roman women were typically educated only in domestic skills, Etruscan women learned to read and write. Numerous inscriptions throughout Etruria record women as sponsors of public works, dedicants of religious offerings, and even as authors of texts. This literacy was not restricted to the aristocracy, but seems to have been relatively widespread among Etruscan women of various social classes. The economic independence of Etruscan women is evident in the archaeological record. Graves of women contain the same range of imported goods and luxury items as those of men, suggesting that women controlled significant economic resources. Business documents and inscriptions record women as traders, artisans, and property owners. Some women even seem to have inherited and managed family businesses, a level of economic independence that was virtually unknown in the contemporary Greek and Roman worlds. The artistic representation of Etruscan women provides further evidence of their elevated status. In Etruscan art, women are portrayed as individuals with distinct personalities and characteristics, rather than as idealized types or symbols. They appear in scenes of daily life, religious ceremonies, and social gatherings, always depicted with dignity and respect. The famous bronze mirror backs that were popular among Etruscan women often show mythological scenes featuring powerful female figures. suggesting that Etruscan women identified with strong, independent female role models. The clothing and jewelry found in women's graves also speak to their status and independence. Etruscan women wore elaborate gold jewelry, fine textiles, and imported luxury goods that would have been accessible only to individuals of significant economic means. The quantity and quality of these goods suggest that women had access to and control over substantial wealth. The contrast between Etruscan women's freedom and the restrictions placed on women in other ancient societies was so striking that it influenced Roman attitudes toward women, even as Rome conquered and absorbed Etruscan territories. Some Roman women, particularly those from families with Etruscan connections, maintained elements of the Etruscan model of female independence. The legendary Roman women who played important roles in politics and society, figures like Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, or Livia, wife of Augustus, may have been influenced by Etruscan traditions of female education and political participation. Decline of Etruscan political power in the 3rd century BCE marked the end of this remarkable experiment in gender equality. As Roman culture became dominant throughout Italy, the freedoms that Etruscan women had enjoyed were gradually eroded. The Roman model of female subordination became the norm, and the memory of Etruscan women's independence was preserved mainly in the critical writings of Greek and Roman authors, who saw it as evidence of moral corruption rather than social progress. The legacy of Etruscan women's freedom was not entirely lost. In the medieval period, some Italian cities maintained traces of more egalitarian traditions that may have had Etruscan roots. The relatively high status of women in Renaissance Italy, compared to other parts of Europe, might reflect the persistence of ancient Etruscan values in the cultural DNA of Central Italy. As we reflect on the remarkable freedom and dignity of Etruscan women, we are reminded that the treatment of women is often a barometer of a society's overall health and sophistication. The Etruscans created a civilization that valued cooperation over domination, balance over hierarchy, and individual dignity over rigid social roles. Their women were not anomalies or exceptions, but integral parts of a society that understood that the full participation of all its members was essential for prosperity and cultural achievement. The graffiti on pottery that records women's property ownership, the inscriptions that document their business dealings, the art that portrays them as individuals rather than symbols, all of these traces speak to a lost world where gender was not a barrier to education, participation, or achievement. In our modern world, as we continue to struggle with issues of gender equality and women's rights, the example of Etruscan women reminds us that such equality is not a modern invention, but a possibility that has existed at various times and places throughout human history. As the evening deepens over the ancient hills of Etruria, we can imagine the conversations that once filled these spaces, conversations in which women's voices were heard, respected, and valued. The Etruscan women who once walked these paths, who managed these households, who participated in these religious ceremonies, have left us a legacy of possibility. They remind us that societies can choose to embrace the full potential of all their members, and that such choices lead not to chaos, but to prosperity, not to weakness, but to strength. The wind carries the scent of wild herbs and ancient olive groves, and in that gentle breeze, we hear the echo of women's laughter, the rustle of fine fabrics, the confident voices of those who knew themselves to be equals in a world that celebrated their contributions. Tomorrow, we will explore the religious and divinatory practices that gave the Etruscans their reputation as the most pious people of the ancient world. But tonight, we remain with the knowledge that in this ancient land, women walked with dignity, spoke with authority, and lived with a freedom that would inspire generations yet to come. The stars shine down on the eternal hills of Tuscany, and in their light, the memory of Etruscan women's achievements continues to illuminate the path toward a more equitable world. To understand the Etruscan soul, one must first understand their relationship with the divine. The Etruscans were, by all accounts, the most religious people of the ancient world. According to Cicero, Etruscan religious literature was divided into three kinds of books: the books of thunderbolts, the books of haruspicy, and the books of rituals. This was not merely a culture that acknowledged the gods. It was a civilization that believed the gods spoke directly to humanity through the natural world, and that human beings, properly trained, could understand this divine language. Picture, if you will, the moment when lightning flashes across the Etruscan sky. While a Greek might see only a natural phenomenon, and a Roman might interpret it as an omen of war or peace, the Etruscan haruspics sees something far more complex and specific. The direction of the lightning, its color, its intensity, the thunder that follows, all of these are part of the sophisticated, cosmic alphabet that the gods used to communicate their will to the world below. The Etruscans divided the sky into 16 sections, each ruled by a different deity, and the movement of lightning through these celestial zones carried specific meanings. The Libri Fulgals dealt with divination by thunderbolt and lightning, or brontoscopy, and these sacred texts contain the accumulated wisdom of centuries of observation and interpretation. A lightning bolt that originated in the northeast and traveled toward the southwest carried a different message than one that moved from north to south, and the trained haruspics could read these celestial signals like a scholar reading a manuscript. But perhaps the most famous and sophisticated of all Etruscan divinatory practices was haruspicy, the art of reading the future in the organs of sacrificed animals. Haruspices, ancient Etruscan diviners, entral observers, whose art consisted primarily in deducing the will of the gods from the appearance presented by the entrails of the sacrificial animal, especially the liver and gallbladder of sheep. This was not mere superstition, but a highly developed science that required years of training and study. The centerpiece of this practice was the liver, which the Etruscans believed was the seat of life itself, and therefore the organ most likely to reflect the divine will. The main task of the haruspicy was precisely the extispitio, i.e. the examination of the viscera of animals, and especially the liver of sheep, of which there were models for the teaching of this doctrine. The most remarkable surviving example of this practice is the bronze liver of Piacenza, discovered by a farmer in 1877, and now one of our most important windows into Etruscan religious thought. Bronze model of a sheep's liver which was used to train Etruscan priests so that they could divine meaning from the livers of sacrificed animals. The liver is divided into 40 sections, with 24 gods named in the inscriptions. This extraordinary artifact, dating to the late 2nd century BCE, reveals the sophistication of Etruscan divination. The bronze liver found in Piacenza served as an ancient, instructive model for students who were in training to become haruspics, suggesting that there were formal schools where this ancient art was taught and preserved. The liver model is covered with Etruscan inscriptions identifying different deities, associated with specific portions of the organ. A 2nd century BC bronze model of a sheep's liver, divided into 16 regions corresponding to sections of the heavens and names of deities, found near Piacenza in 1877. Correlation between the divisions of the liver and the sections of the sky reveals the sophisticated cosmological thinking that underpinned Etruscan religion. The gods who ruled different portions of the heavens also governed corresponding areas of the liver, creating a divine map that connected the earthly and celestial realms. The process of haruspicy was both ritual and scientific. The animal would be sacrificed according to precise ceremonial requirements, and then the haruspics would carefully examine the liver, noting its size, color, texture, and any unusual features. The Etruscans used haruspicy, searching for omens in the entrails of animals, to predict the future. Etruscan fortune-tellers were famous for their liver-reading skills. After a sacrifice, the body was opened up and the liver was examined. The liver was divided into region, which corresponds with the sections of the sky, allowing the priest to determine which deities were sending messages and what those messages might mean. The reputation of Etruscan haruspices spread throughout the ancient world. The practice of haruspicy has its roots in Etruscan culture, where it was highly developed and respected. The Etruscans believed in the significance of omens derived from the natural world, particularly through the examination of animal organs, which they regarded as messages from the gods. Even after the political power of the Etruscans waned, Roman generals continued to consult Etruscan haruspices before major battles, and these priests maintained their influence well into the imperial period. The training of haruspics was a lifelong commitment. Young men chosen for this calling would spend years studying the sacred texts, learning to recognize the subtle variations in organ color and texture that indicated different divine messages, and practicing the complex rituals required for proper sacrifice and interpretation. The knowledge was closely guarded, passed down through priestly families and sacred schools, creating a tradition of religious expertise that lasted for nearly a millennium. But Etruscan divination was not limited to liver reading and lightning. Interpretation. The omens, as interpreted by the bird watcher, the seer, and the old woman, included divination by flight of birds, haruspicy, divination by examining the entrails of sacrificial animals, and an enigmatic procedure using tokens with symbolic names. The flight patterns of birds, the behavior of animals, the growth patterns of plants, even the way smoke rose from sacrificial fires. All of these were part of the vast network of signs through which the gods communicated with humanity. Etruscan pantheon was complex and hierarchical, with different deities governing different aspects of life and nature. At the head of the pantheon stood Tenia, the sky god equivalent to Jupiter, who ruled over lightning and thunder. His wife Uni, similar to the Roman Juno, governed marriage and childbirth, while Menra, the goddess of wisdom and war, corresponded to the Romang Minerva. But the Etruscan pantheon also included numerous local deities, nature spirits, and ancestral gods who played important roles in daily religious observance. The religious calendar of the Etruscans was rich with festivals and ceremonies designed to maintain harmony between the human and divine realms. Unlike the contractual relationship that characterized much of Roman religion, where specific offerings were made in exchange for specific divine favors, Etruscan religion emphasized the need for constant communication and cooperation with the gods. The universe was seen as a living, breathing entity where divine and human will be constantly interacting. The sacred spaces of Etruscan religion reflected this complex understanding of the divine. Temples were oriented according to strict astronomical principles, with their layouts corresponding to the divisions of the sky used in lightning divination. Sacred groves, natural springs, and caves were all considered points of contact between the human and divine worlds. A careful placement of these religious sites across the Etruscan landscape created a sacred geography that reinforced the connection between earthly and celestial realms. The influence of Etruscan religious practices on Roman culture cannot be overstated. The Roman practice of consulting haruspices before important decisions, the use of augury to determine divine will, and even the architectural principles governing temple construction all had their origins in Etruscan tradition. Many of the most important Roman religious festivals and ceremonies were adaptations of earlier Etruscan rituals, though often stripped of their original theological complexity. The decline of Etruscan political power in the 3rd century BC, it did not immediately end their religious influence. Etruscan haruspices continued to be consulted by Roman leaders well into the imperial period, and their interpretation of omens played a role in major historical decisions. However, as Roman culture became increasingly rationalistic and philosophical, the ancient traditions of divination gradually lost their authority and influence. The legacy of Etruscan religion extends far beyond its immediate historical context. The idea that the natural world serves as a medium for divine communication, that trained interpreters can read the signs and omens that surround us, and that human beings must maintain harmonious relationships with the forces that govern the universe. These concepts have echoed through Western thought for millennia. In various forms, they can be found in medieval Christian mysticism, Renaissance, natural philosophy, and even in modern environmental thinking. As we sit in the gathering darkness of a Tuscan evening, with storm clouds building on the horizon, we can almost feel the presence of those ancient haruspices who once stood in these same places, watching the sky for signs of divine will. Their world was one where every natural phenomenon carried meaning, where the gods spoke constantly to those who knew how to listen, and where human beings had the responsibility to interpret and respond to the messages written in the very fabric of creation. The flash of lightning that illuminates the landscape for a brief moment reminds us that the Etruscans lived in a universe alive with meaning and purpose. They refused to accept that the natural world was merely a collection of random phenomena, insisting instead that behind every storm, every sacrifice, every flight of birds, there was a divine intelligence trying to communicate with humanity. In their patient observation of these signs, their careful recording of patterns and meanings, and their dedication to maintaining communication with the gods, they created one of the most sophisticated religious systems the ancient world ever knew. The rain begins to fall gently on the ancient stones, and in that soft percussion, we hear the whisper of ancient wisdom, the echo of prayers spoken in a language that predates Rome, and the timeless reminder that the divine and human worlds are forever intertwined in the great dance of existence. The morning mist clings to the ancient stones of Veii, one of the great Etruscan cities that once challenged Rome itself. Here, beneath layers of earth and centuries of forgotten time, lie the foundations of what we have come to call Roman engineering. But tonight, as shadows lengthen across these weathered ruins, we discover that the genius attributed to Rome began in quieter hands, in minds that saw the world not as something to conquer, but as something to understand. Walk with me through these silent streets, where grass grows between flagstones laid 25 centuries ago. Feel the smooth surface beneath your feet. Notice how these stones fit together with such precision that not even the finest blade could slip between them. This is the legacy of the Etruscans, though history has been slow to acknowledge it. The Etruscans were builders of a different sort than those who came after. Where Romans would later construct monuments to power and conquest, the Etruscans built for harmony with the natural world. Their cities seemed to emerge from the landscape itself, following the contours of hillsides, embracing the flow of rivers, working with the earth rather than imposing upon it. In the ruins of Cerveteri, you can still see the remains of their ingenious drainage systems. The Etruscans excelled at constructing drainage tunnels, known as cuniculi, which removed excess water from arable land. These underground channels, carved through solid rock, stretch for miles beneath the Etruscan territories. They represent not just engineering skill, but a profound understanding of water's behavior, of how it moves through soil and stone, seeking its own level. The Romans would later claim mastery over water, building their famous aqueducts across the empire. But the knowledge began here, in these quiet tunnels where Etruscan engineers learned to channel water's power. The earliest aqueducts of Rome were constructed in a manner similar to the drainage channels built by the Etruscans. What Rome made monumental, the Etruscans had made functional. Consider the great Cloaca Maxima, Rome's legendary sewer system, still functioning today after more than 2 millennia. Yet this marvel of engineering was built upon Etruscan principles, using techniques perfected in the cities of Etruria. The first sewers of ancient Rome were built around 500 BC by the Romans in imitation of the Etruscans. The Romans learned from their predecessors, then expanded these humble beginnings into the grand infrastructure that would serve an empire. But water was only part of the Etruscan legacy. Their mastery of the arch, that fundamental element of Roman architecture, began in the tombs and temples of Etruria. In the necropolis of Tarquinia, you can descend into burial chambers where corbelled arches have supported the weight of earth for over 2,000 years. These are not the grand triumphal arches of Rome, but intimate spaces where the living honored the dead. The Etruscans understood that stone could be made to fly. They carved voussoirs, the wedge-shaped stones that form an arch, with mathematical precision. Each stone supports its neighbors, and all together support the weight above. This was revolutionary thinking, a departure from the simple post and lintel construction that had dominated earlier architecture. The vaulted ceilings, arches, Tuscan column, and monumental city gates of Etruscan architecture would influence and inspire later Roman architects. The Romans would perfect these techniques, creating the soaring domes and vast interior spaces that still inspire awe today. But the first tentative steps toward these achievements were taken in the workshops of Etruscan builders. The Etruscan temple was another innovation that Rome would inherit and transform. Unlike Greek temples, which were designed to be admired from all sides, Etruscan temples had a clear front and back. They sat on high platforms, accessed by steps that led to a deep porch supported by columns. The columns themselves were distinctly Etruscan, simpler than their Greek counterparts, but no less elegant in their proportions. These temples were built primarily of wood and terracotta, materials that have not survived as well as stone. Yet their influence lived on in Roman architecture. Whatever its size, the Etruscan temple's influence on other early Roman temples was significant and long-lasting. The Romans would rebuild these structures in stone and marble, but the essential forms remained Etruscan. The city gates of Etruscan towns were marvels of engineering and artistry. The Porta Augusta at Perugia, with its graceful arch and decorative stonework, still stands as a testament to Etruscan skill. These gates were not merely functional. They were symbols of civic pride, welcoming visitors and protecting citizens. The Romans would later build gates of greater grandeur, but they learned the principles here, in the cities of Etruria. Perhaps most remarkably, the Etruscans were masters of surveying and urban planning. Their cities were laid out according to religious principles, with streets oriented to the cardinal directions and sacred spaces carefully positioned. This was not random development, but conscious design, based on their understanding of the spiritual significance of space and orientation. The Romans would later systematize this knowledge, creating the rigid grid patterns that characterized their military camps and colonial towns. But the underlying principles came from Etruscan practice, from a people who saw the city as a sacred space where human activity should harmonize with divine will. In the workshops of Etruscan craftsmen, bronze was worked with extraordinary skill. They created not just decorative objects, but functional tools and architectural elements. Bronze fittings for doors, decorative elements for buildings, and even structural components were cast with precision that would not be matched again for centuries. This metallurgical expertise would become another pillar of Roman engineering. The Romans learned to work iron on a scale unprecedented in the ancient world, but the techniques began with Etruscan bronze workers who understood how heat and hammering could transform raw ore into useful objects. The Etruscans also excelled at hydraulic engineering beyond simple drainage. They created complex systems of floodgates, tunnels, barrages, artificial lakes, and wells to distribute water during droughts. These systems required not just technical skill, but deep understanding of watershed management, of how water moved. Across the landscape in different seasons, walk through the ruins of an Etruscan city in your mind's eye. See the carefully laid streets, the buildings that seem to grow from the hillside, the water channels that carry away the rain. This is architecture in harmony with nature, engineering that serves human needs without overwhelming the environment. Romans would take these principles and scale them up to serve an empire. They would build longer roads, higher aqueducts, larger amphitheaters. But the fundamental understanding of how to work with stone and water, how to create spaces that serve human needs while respecting natural forces, began here in the quiet. Cities of Etruria. As night settles over these ancient stones, remember that the grandeur of Rome was built on foundations laid by the Etruscans. Many of the things that the Romans are so famous for, such as their amazing hydraulic engineering, can be traced back to the Etruscans. The arch, the aqueduct, the planned city, the temple on its platform, all these began as Etruscan innovations. The Etruscans built not for conquest, but for life, not for glory, but for harmony. Their cities were human-scaled, their engineering subtle but effective. They understood that the greatest architecture is often invisible, that the finest engineering serves its purpose so well that it draws no attention to itself, not in the quiet darkness of these ruins. Their legacy lives on. Every Roman arch carries within it the memory of Etruscan innovation. Every aqueduct traces its lineage back to the water channels of Etruria. Every planned city reflects the Etruscan understanding of sacred space and human need, the stones beneath. Our feet have stories to tell, if we know how to listen. They speak of a people who saw building not as domination, but as collaboration with the natural world. They whisper of engineers who channeled water not to display power, but to serve life. They murmur of architects who created spaces for worship, for commerce, for the daily rhythms of human existence. As you prepare for sleep, let these ancient stones teach you their patience. They have waited centuries for their story to be told, for their contributions to be acknowledged. They teach us that true innovation often comes not from those who seek glory, but from those who seek solutions. Not from those who build for eternity, but from those who build for life. The Etruscans understood that the greatest monuments are not always the most visible ones. Sometimes the most profound legacy is the one that disappears into the foundation, holding up everything that comes after. Their engineering genius lives on in every Roman bridge, every medieval cathedral, every modern building that uses the arch to span space and support weight. Rest now. As these stones rest, knowing that their quiet strength continues to support the world above. In your dreams, walk through cities where engineering serves humanity, where architecture honors the earth, where the built environment and the natural world exist in perfect harmony. This is the dream of the Etruscans, and it lives on in every stone they laid, every channel they carved, every arch they built to span the distance between earth and sky. A Tiber River flows quietly through the darkness, its waters carrying memories of a time when Rome was not yet the eternal city, but merely one settlement among many along its muddy banks. Tonight, as the river whispers its ancient secrets, to the reeds and willows, we return to a story that history has told only in fragments. A tale of how the greatest empire the world had ever known began not as conqueror, but as student. In the soft light of dawn, breaking over the 7 hills. Imagine Rome as it once was, not the marble metropolis of later centuries, but a collection of humble villages perched on defensible heights. The people who lived here were farmers and herders, their lives governed by the seasons and the simple rhythms of rural existence. They built their houses of wood and clay, worshipped their gods in sacred groves, and lived much as their ancestors had for countless generations. But across the river, in the cities of Etruria, a different world flourished. While Rome's inhabitants struggled with the basic challenges of survival, the Etruscans had already created a civilization of remarkable sophistication. Their cities gleamed with bronze and terracotta. Their markets bustled with goods from across the Mediterranean, and their artists created works of beauty that would inspire generations to come. It was inevitable that these two worlds would meet, and when they did, the meeting would change the course of history. The Etruscans, with their advanced knowledge of engineering, their sophisticated understanding of governance, and their connections to the wider world, looked upon the rustic settlements of Rome with a mixture of opportunity and benevolence. Traditional story tells us that Rome was founded by Romulus in 753 BC, a tale of divine intervention and heroic determination. But the archaeological evidence whispers a different truth. The early Romans were deeply influenced by their Etruscan neighbors, learning from them the arts of civilization, the techniques of urban planning, and the principles of organized government. By the 6th century BC, this influence had become direct rule. The last three kings of Rome, according to tradition, were Etruscan. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Lucius Tarquinius Superbus brought to Rome the accumulated wisdom of Etruscan civilization. Under their rule, Rome was transformed from a collection of villages into a true city. These Etruscan kings gave Rome its first sewers, its first permanent buildings, its first organized government. They introduced the fasces, the bundle of rods. That would become the symbol of Roman authority. They established the system of augury, the reading of omens that would guide Roman decision-making for centuries. They brought to Rome the gladiatorial games, the theatrical performances, and the elaborate religious ceremonies that would define Roman culture. Tarquinius Priscus, the first of the Etruscan kings, came to Rome as an immigrant seeking opportunity. According to legend, he was welcomed because of his wealth and wisdom, his knowledge of the larger world beyond the Seven Hills. He enlarged the city, built the great sewer system, and established the Circus Maximus, where Romans would gather to watch chariot races and other spectacles. His successor, Servius Tullius, continued the work of transformation. He built the first walls around the city, organized the population into tribes and centuries, and established the census system. That would become fundamental to Roman administration. These innovations came not from Roman tradition, but from Etruscan practice, from a people who had already solved the problems of governing complex urban societies. The last of the Etruscan kings, Tarquinius Superbus, ruled Rome with increasing arrogance and cruelty. His tyrannical behavior eventually provoked a rebellion that would drive him from the city and establish the Roman Republic. But even in their rejection of monarchy, the Romans retained the institutions and practices that the Etruscans had given them. The expulsion of the Tarquin dynasty in 509 BC marked the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between Rome and Etruria. No longer ruled by Etruscan kings, the Romans now faced their former teachers as equals, and eventually as rivals. The student was about to surpass the master, but the lessons learned would never be forgotten. In the early years of the Republic, Rome struggled to establish itself as an independent power. The Etruscans, led by the powerful city of Veii, saw an opportunity to reassert their influence over their former possession. Wars broke out between Rome and the Etruscan cities, conflicts that would rage intermittently for centuries. The siege of Veii, lasting from 406 to 396 BC, marked a turning point in this struggle. Veii was Rome's closest Etruscan neighbor, a wealthy city that controlled important trade routes and possessed advanced military technology. The Romans, still learning the arts of warfare on a grand scale, laid siege to the city for 10 long years, a conflict that would later be compared to the siege of Troy. The fall of Veii demonstrated Rome's growing military prowess, but it also marked the beginning of the end for Etruscan independence. One by one, the great cities of Etruria would fall to Roman expansion. Tarquinia, Cara, Volci, and the others would be absorbed into the growing Roman Confederation. their people becoming Roman citizens, but their distinctive culture gradually fading. Yet this was not a simple story of conquest and destruction. The Romans, even as they defeated the Etruscans militarily, continued to learn from them culturally. Etruscan artists were welcomed in Rome, their skills highly valued. Etruscan religious practices were incorporated into Roman worship. Etruscan noble families were absorbed into the Roman aristocracy, their knowledge and connections valuable assets for the growing republic. The relationship between Rome and Etruria in these centuries was complex and nuanced. It was neither pure conquest nor peaceful absorption, but something in between. The Romans admired Etruscan civilization, even as they competed with it. They borrowed freely from Etruscan culture, while asserting their own political independence. This pattern would be repeated throughout Roman history. The Romans were remarkably adept at absorbing the best elements of the cultures they encountered, incorporating foreign innovations into their own system, while maintaining their political dominance. The Etruscans were their first teachers in this art of cultural synthesis. The Roman legions that would eventually conquer the Mediterranean world were organized along principles first developed by the Etruscans. The Roman system of colonies, which would spread Roman culture from Britain to the Middle East, was based on Etruscan models. The Roman conception of citizenship, which would eventually embrace millions of people across the empire, had its roots in Etruscan political thought. Even the Latin language itself was enriched by Etruscan vocabulary. Words for government, religion, and daily life entered Latin from Etruscan sources. The Romans might have conquered the Etruscans politically, but linguistically and culturally, the influence flowed in both directions. The Roman historian Livy, writing centuries later, acknowledged the debt that Rome owed to the Etruscans. He described how Roman youth were sent to Etruscan cities to receive their education, much as later generations would send their children to Athens to study philosophy. The Etruscans were acknowledged masters of divination, of engineering, of the arts of civilized life. By the 1st century BC, the process of absorption was complete. The last independent Etruscan cities had become Roman municipalities. The Etruscan language was no longer spoken in public life, though it lingered in religious ceremonies and family traditions. The distinctive Etruscan culture had been absorbed into the larger Roman world, yet the influence persisted in ways both visible and hidden. The Roman eagle, symbol of imperial power, echoed Etruscan religious imagery. The Roman triumph, the great parade that celebrated military victory, followed Etruscan ritual patterns. The Roman toga, the garment of citizenship, was cut in the Etruscan fashion. In the quiet darkness of the Roman Forum, where senators once debated the fate of the world, you can still see the influence of Etruscan design. The temples, the basilicas, the public buildings all bear the stamp of Etruscan architectural principles. The very layout of the Forum, with its careful attention to religious and civic functions, reflects Etruscan understanding of urban planning. The Romans would go on to build the greatest empire in ancient history, but they never forgot the lessons learned from their Etruscan teachers. The administrative skills, the engineering knowledge, the artistic sensibilities that would characterize Roman civilization all had their roots in the cities of Etruria. As you settle into sleep, remember this story of transformation and inheritance. The Romans did not create their civilization from nothing. They built upon foundations laid by the Etruscans, learning from a people who had already solved many of the problems of urban life. The student eventually surpassed the teacher, but the lessons learned were never forgotten. The Tiber continues its quiet journey to the sea, carrying with it the memories of two people whose fates became intertwined. In its waters, the reflections of Etruscan and Roman merge and blur, until it becomes impossible to say where one ends and the other begins. This is the true story of Roman greatness, built not on conquest alone, but but on the wisdom inherited from those who came before. In the deepest hours of night, when the world grows quiet and the boundaries between past and present blur like shadows on ancient walls, we find ourselves standing in the great libraries of Rome. Here, among scrolls of papyrus and tablets of wax, the official history of the empire was written and rewritten, each generation adding its own interpretation to the story of Roman greatness. But tonight, we seek a different tale, one written not in words, but in the daily life of the people, in the customs they practiced, the names they bore, and the gods they worshipped. The Etruscans did not vanish when Rome conquered their cities. They did not disappear when their language faded from public discourse. Instead, they became invisible, woven so thoroughly into the fabric of Roman life that their presence was taken for granted, their contributions assumed to be naturally remote. Like a river that flows underground, Etruscan culture continued to nourish the civilization that had absorbed it. Walk through the streets of imperial Rome in your imagination, and you will see Etruscan influence everywhere, though it bears no nameplate, claims no recognition. The very names of the Roman people tell this story. Marcus, Gaius, Lucius, these quintessentially Roman names have Etruscan roots. The great patrician families of Rome, the Claudii, the Fabii, the Sexili, traced their lineages back to Etruscan. Ancestors who had been absorbed into the Roman aristocracy dot in the grand houses of these noble families. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, their faces captured in wax masks that preserved not just their features, but their dignity. This practice, so central to Roman family life, was inherited from the Etruscans, who had long honored their dead with realistic portrayals. The Roman reverence for ancestors, the belief that the dead continued to influence the living, flowed directly from Etruscan religious thought. The Roman calendar itself bore the stamp of Etruscan wisdom. The month of September, the seventh month in the original Roman year, derived its name from the Etruscan word for seven. The intricate system of divination that guided Roman decision-making, the reading of omens in the flight of birds, and the examination of sacrificial victims was pure Etruscan practice. Though Romans came to consider it their own ancient tradition, in the great amphitheaters where gladiators fought and died for the entertainment of the masses, the spectacle unfolded according to Etruscan ritual patterns. The gladiatorial games themselves were originally Etruscan funeral rites, ways of honoring the dead by demonstrating the courage and skill of the living. The Romans transformed these intimate ceremonies into grand public spectacles, but the essential elements remained unchanged. The Roman triumph, that magnificent parade that celebrated military victory, followed Etruscan ceremonial traditions. The victorious general, painted red in imitation of the god Jupiter, rode through the streets in a chariot, while a slave whispered reminders of mortality in his ear. This ritual theater, designed to honor the gods while warning against hubris, was quintessentially Etruscan in its understanding of the relationship between divine and human power. Even the Roman toga, that symbol of citizenship and dignity, was cut in the Etruscan fashion. The way a Roman draped his toga, the careful attention to its folds and angles, reflected Etruscan understanding of how clothing expressed social status and personal character. The purple stripe that marked the senatorial class, the golden ornaments that adorned the garments of the wealthy, all followed patterns established in the cities of Etruria, in the temples of Rome. The very architecture spoke of Etruscan influence. The high platforms, the deep porches, the emphasis on the facade rather than the sides, all reflected Etruscan religious architecture. The Romans built their temples larger and more elaborate, covered them with marble instead of terracotta, but the essential forms remained unchanged from their Etruscan origins. The Roman household gods, the Lares and Penates, who protected the family and the home, were Etruscan deities wearing Roman names. The rituals of worship, the offerings of food and wine, the careful attention to proper ceremonies, all reflected Etruscan religious practice. The Romans might have added new gods to their pantheon, but the underlying structure of domestic worship remained essentially Etruscan. Roman law, that great achievement of Roman civilization, incorporated many Etruscan legal concepts. The idea of written law, the careful distinction between public and private offenses, the procedures for trial and punishment, all had precedence in Etruscan legal tradition. The 12 Tables, Rome's first written legal code, borrowed heavily from Etruscan jurisprudence, though this debt was rarely acknowledged. The Roman system of augury, the official interpretation of divine will through natural signs, was administered by colleges of priests who preserved Etruscan learning. The haruspices, the specialists who read omens in the entrails of sacrificed animals, were often ethnic Etruscans who maintained their ancestral knowledge even as they served Roman masters. Their expertise was so valued that the practice continued well into the Christian era. In the Roman army, the organization of legions, the system of military engineering, the techniques of siege warfare, all reflected Etruscan military innovation. The Roman military manuals, written centuries after the conquest of Etruria, still acknowledge the debt to Etruscan tactical thinking. The Romans added their own innovations, created new formations and strategies, but the foundation remained Etruscan. The great families of the Roman Empire often traced their ancestry back to Etruscan nobles who had been granted Roman citizenship. The Emperor Claudius, himself a descendant of Etruscan aristocrats, wrote a history of the Etruscan people that has since been lost. His deep interest in Etruscan culture reflected not just scholarly curiosity, but personal connection to a heritage that had shaped his own family's identity. Roman literature, too, bore the influence of Etruscan thought. The Roman fascination with fate and destiny, the belief that individual lives were shaped by forces beyond human control, reflected Etruscan philosophical traditions. The Roman love of prophecy, the careful attention to omens and portents, the belief that the future could be read in natural signs, all echoed Etruscan religious thought. The Roman circus, where chariot races thrilled the masses, was organized according to Etruscan principles of sacred space and ritual performance. The track itself, with its careful orientation and symbolic decorations, reflected Etruscan understanding of how earthly events mirrored heavenly patterns. The races were not mere entertainment, but religious ceremonies, ways of honoring the gods. Through displays of skill and courage, even Roman funeral practices preserved Etruscan traditions. The elaborate processions, the public displays of grief, the careful attention to proper burial procedures, all reflected Etruscan beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead. The Roman tomb monuments, with their realistic portraits and detailed inscriptions, continued Etruscan traditions of honoring ancestors. The Roman bathhouses, those centers of social life where citizens gathered to exercise, conduct business, and engage in philosophical discussion, were based on Etruscan models. The careful attention to water temperature, the elaborate heating systems, the combination of practical and social functions, all reflected Etruscan understanding of how architecture could serve human needs. In the great libraries of Rome, where scholars preserved the wisdom of the ancient world, Etruscan books were collected and studied. Roman intellectuals recognized that Etruscan learning was ancient and valuable, even if they considered it superseded by Roman achievements. The loss of these books represents one of the great tragedies of cultural transmission, depriving us of direct access to Etruscan thought. The Roman system of colonies, which spread Roman culture throughout the Mediterranean world, was based on Etruscan models of urban planning and administration. A careful attention to city layout, the integration of religious and civic functions, the balance between central authority and local autonomy, all reflected Etruscan political wisdom. As the Roman Empire expanded, It carried Etruscan cultural elements to the far corners of the known world. Roman soldiers stationed in Britain or Syria brought with them customs and practices that had originated in the cities of Etruria. The Etruscan heritage became part of the universal Roman culture that united diverse peoples under a single imperial system. The transformation was so complete that the Romans themselves forgot the origins of many of their most cherished traditions. What had begun as conscious borrowing became unconscious inheritance. The Etruscans had not been conquered so much as absorbed, their culture becoming so thoroughly Roman that the distinction lost all meaning got in the quiet darkness of history. The Etruscans achieved a kind of immortality. Their cities crumbled. Their language faded, their political independence vanished, but their cultural DNA was passed down through generations of Romans. They lived on in the daily practices of ordinary people, in the unconscious gestures that linked past and present. The great irony is that the Etruscans, who valued privacy and domestic life, achieved their greatest influence through the most public of empires. Their understanding of family, their respect for women, their belief in the importance of religious observance, all became part of the Roman character that would shape Western civilization. Night has deepened across the hills of Tuscany. The stars above Etruria shimmer with a quiet kind of wisdom. The winds have stilled, and the olive trees stand in silent watch over the tombs carved deep into the earth. Within those ancient chambers, the painted walls remain. Dancers forever frozen in mid-step, musicians caught in the act of playing an eternal tune, and banquets laid out in celebration, not of life's end, but its continuation. The Etruscans believed in joy beyond death, in memory that lingers through time, in beauty that speaks without words. Though their cities crumbled and their names were lost, their presence never truly vanished. It lives on in the archways of Roman forums, in the symmetry of aqueducts, in the rituals of old temples, and in the fragments of language buried in bronze plates and terracotta urns. The spirit of the Etruscans was not destroyed. It was folded into history's deeper layers, where only those who dream quietly can hear it calling dot in this stillness. You might imagine standing at the entrance of an Etruscan tomb, a torch in hand, watching the flicker of light dance across figures drawn 2,000 years ago. Their faces seem to look back at you with a knowing calm, as if aware that time cannot erase everything, that even forgotten stories can find their way home. Perhaps they are smiling, not just because they are remembered tonight, but because someone across centuries and continents is listening again. Listening to the silence between the stones, to the unspoken poetry etched into the earth. Now, as your eyes begin to close, know that the journey does not end here. It continues in dreams, in quiet reflections, in the simple act of wondering. What came before? The Etruscans, those mysterious artisans and philosophers of the early world, have whispered their tale to you. It is yours to carry gently into slumber. Let your thoughts drift like mist through the valleys of Etruria. Let the rhythm of ancient footsteps lull your mind into rest. Let sleep come not as a forgetting, but as a remembering of something long. Buried and beautiful thank you for traveling with us tonight through the silent paths of history. May your dreams be filled with moonlit hills, painted walls, and gentle echoes of a civilization that still waits to be fully heard. You have been listening to Mystic Bedtime Stories. Sleep well, and until next time, may history hold you in its quiet arms.